High in the Pontic mountains, Greeks carved out lives on the edge of the known world, and they started something that none of them would have believed. This is part one of the story of the Pontic Greeks, a people who endured on the Black Sea's southern shores for nearly 3,000 years. Here we follow their beginnings, why they left their homelands, how they built cities in unforgiving terrain, and how those choices set the stage for a kingdom that would one day defy Rome. In the early first millennium BCE, the Greek world stood at a crossroads. The Archaic period was taking shape, an era that would lay the foundations for the classical age that we all know and love. And this would be driven by those bold enough to push beyond the familiar shores they already called home. One of the most extraordinary expressions of this early mobility was the colonization of the Black Sea's southern coast, later to be known as Pontus, the sea. The impulses behind this movement were complex, but not necessarily unique to this region. Greeks had already begun founding colonies across the western Mediterranean. Cumae in Italy, for example, was established around 740 BCE by Euboean settlers. And this is just one famous example. Yet the Black Sea frontier held its own distinct allure and its own distinct challenges. But these challenges abroad were only half the story. At home, between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE, Greek polis saw steady population growth as the Archaic period unfolded. And when farmland reached its limits, and the arable plots grew scarcer and scarcer, social tensions flared. In aristocratic societies, where political participation was narrowly confined, land ownership meant far more than survival. It was the very foundation of status. For younger sons denied inheritance, for landless citizens seeking opportunity, and for ambitious traders pushing against constraints, the city walls could feel like a prison. Colonization emerged as both escape valve and political strategy. By sending settlers abroad, cities eased pressures at home while extending their reach across the Mediterranean. Colonists usually sought divine sanction, most often from the oracle at Delphi, sometimes from Dodona, to legitimize their venture and preserve continuity with home. The new settlement, the Apoikia, maintained cultural and religious bonds with its metropolis, its mother city, though political autonomy varied from colony to colony. Some colonies became fully independent, and others remained tethered more tightly to their parent city. Departure for colonists was voluntary, but deeply ritualized. Colonists carried fire from their city's hearth, sacred images of protective gods, and a civic charter. Their mission was both familiar and profound: to recreate abroad the essentials of Greek life, shared language, religious practice, laws, and communal space, all in the far-off lands of a new world. No Greek city pursued colonization with more ambition than Miletus. Perched on Anatolia's western coast, this maritime powerhouse commanded access to both the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. By the 7th century BCE, it had become the undisputed leader of Black Sea colonization. Ancient writers credited it with founding, or at least influencing, 20 to 30 colonies in the region, though some inflated accounts stretch that number to as high as 90. Whatever the exaggeration, the pattern is clear. Miletus deliberately expanded eastward, through the Bosphorus, into Pontus, and along the northern shores of the Black Sea. Why Miletus, though, you wonder? Several factors made the city uniquely suited for this role. A wealthy merchant class with broad ambitions, generations of seafaring expertise, and long-standing ties to both Aegean and Anatolian trade. Its political life, often shaped by oligarchs or tyrants, gave commercial elites room to take risks, much like Venetian merchants of years later. This was also the intellectual home of pioneers like Thales and Anaximander, a city where inquiry, exploration, and bold experimentation thrived. On the other hand, the Black Sea was no easy frontier. Early Greeks called it Pontos Axinos, the inhospitable sea, a name that reflected both the danger of unknown waters and their clashes with indigenous peoples. Yet as trade routes solidified and settlements took root, confidence grew, and the name softened into Pontos Euxiknos, the hospitable sea. That shift in language tells the story. Perception itself could transform a forbidding frontier into an inviting destination. The southern Black Sea coast offered extraordinary promise. Its steep mountains supplied abundant timber and rich veins of ore, while great rivers like the Halys and the Iris cut fertile valleys into the land. Most enticing of all, the region's position opened trade routes that reached the Scythians, the Colchians, and after the mid-6th century BCE, the expanding Persian Empire. Greek merchants arrived with olive oil, wine, fine ceramics, and silver. They left, though, with their ships heavy with grain, furs, gold, and sadly slaves. Out of this opportunity rose several settlements that would shape Pontus for centuries. Sinope, modern Sinope, the crown jewel of Milesian colonization, was founded in the late 7th century BCE. Its natural harbor made it a center for long-distance trade, and by the 6th century it boasted temples and its own coinage. Trapezus, modern Trebizond, is one of the boldest eastern outposts, a staging point for goods flowing from Armenia and even as far as the Caspian. Amisos, modern Samson, commanded the fertile Iris River delta, with rich hinterlands that promised lasting prosperity. In Kotiora, modern Urdu, smaller but vital nonetheless, linking inland mountain passes with the sea. Each colony began humbly, simple wooden palisades for defense, granaries for storage, harbors for their ships. Yet within a generation, many grew into thriving polis, with grid-planned streets, temples, bustling marketplaces, and their own coinage. Outposts became cities, and frontier footholds became lasting communities. The Pontic coast was never empty. Greeks encountered indigenous peoples, the Tibareni, Halybes, and the Masanosi among them, who had lived in the mountains and valleys, their communities deeply rooted in this rugged landscape. Classical writers described them with a mix of curiosity and bias, noting unusual customs, while also recording trade and alliances. Archaeology fills in the gaps further, revealing sustained exchange, intermarriage, and real material interaction between Greeks and locals. The settlers proved adaptable. They didn't fully impose their Mediterranean ways, nor did they abandon their own identity. Instead, they found a middle path. Architecture adjusted to the mountain terrain. Burial practices blended local and Greek elements. Even some native gods were absorbed into the Greek pantheon, especially in later centuries. At the core, the polis structure endured, but it bent to the local needs, showing that Greek institutions could be flexible, far from the core of Hellenic lands. Rather than forcing a single cultural template, Greek life in Pontus developed through exchange, accommodation, and creative fusion. It was a frontier identity, tested by its environment and transformed through contact, yet still tied to the wider Greek world. What took root along the Pontic coast was not conquest, but cooperation and pragmatism. These colonies balanced continuity with necessity, keeping core elements like language and ritual while answering the economic and social pressures that had driven them from home in the first place. The settlements were both a release valve for the crowded polis and a gateway to the resources of Anatolia's interior, after all. Over time, this eastward movement laid the groundwork for something new, a distinct Pontic Greek identity. That identity would not fully emerge until centuries later, but the seeds were already there. What began as merchant outposts and trading stations would harden into resilient communities, capable of enduring conquest, shifting allegiances, and the rise and fall of empires, all while preserving a cultural essence that remained recognizably Greek. In the 7th century BCE, such futures were unimaginable. For the colonists, the reality was immediate. Ships hauled onto unfamiliar shores, the sacred fire rekindled from the hearth of the homeland, and the cycle of the polis beginning anew in a foreign land. By the mid 6th century BCE, the map of Anatolia was redrawn. The once mighty Lydian kingdom collapsed before the campaigns of Cyrus the Great, and when Sardis fell around 456 BCE, Persian rule spread swiftly across western Asia Minor. Even the distant Greek colonies of the southern Black Sea, places like Sinope, felt the ripple. Geography offered no real shield from imperial ambition. Yet Persian rule in Pontus was less about conquest and more about accommodation. Tribute was expected, loyalty required, but the cities kept a surprising degree of autonomy. Councils met, temples remained active, and trade carried on under Persian oversight. Pontus now found itself linked to something far larger, a vast empire stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, a network of roads, tribute routes, and royal authority. For the colonists, it was not the end of their independence, but the beginning of a long apprenticeship and survival under the great empires of the ancient world. Pontus sat on the edge of the Persian world, too far north to be tightly controlled, but too valuable to be left alone. Unlike the rebellious Aegean cities who had to be watched carefully, the Pontic coast was treated with a lighter hand. Its rugged mountains and scattered tribes made direct rule impractical. Persian authority here was usually channeled through Cappadocia or nearby satraps. They didn't build new cities or impose heavy oversight. Instead, they leaned on what was already there: Greek colonies on the coast and local elites inland. Greek remained the language of the settlements. Temples carried on their old rituals. Councils still gathered, and while tribute flowed south, daily life was left almost intact. It was empire by convenience. The Persians gained loyalty and a foothold on the Black Sea, while the Greeks and locals kept a surprising degree of freedom. So while the Pontus began as a frontier for the Ionian and wider Hellenic world, it became a prize not reshaped but managed, a buffer zone, a trade corridor, and a quiet but essential link into the wider Persian world. Loyalty wasn't measured by grand ceremonies or fiery speeches for the Persian rulers. It was measured in two things: tribute and peace. For the Pontic coast, this meant timber from the mountains, fish from the sea, and access to harbors that could serve imperial commerce and campaigns. Ports like Sinope and Trapezus became lifelines of exchange, while horses from the steppe, gold from the mountains, and even textiles and lapis lazuli all funneled through their markets, tying the region into trade routes that stretched deep into the empire. The Persians built no royal road here, but Pontus was never cut off. Local routes linked the coast to Cappadocia and beyond, making it useful enough to matter, but not central enough to invite the suffocating oversight of the Persian state. And unlike in other corners of the empire, Persians didn't treat Greeks as a constant problem. Ionian Greeks served them as diplomats, soldiers, engineers, and craftsmen. Along the Pontic coast, settlers played a quieter but vital role, keeping ports open, securing trade, and dealing with neighbors like the Colchians and the Scythians. Empire by pragmatism was serving the Persians well, a balance where the great king got what he needed, and the Greeks kept much of their civic and religious life intact. And the material record shows this. Cultural exchange in Pontus was real, though perhaps restrained. The Pontus wasn't a story of cultural conquest, but of selective borrowing. In cities like Amisos and Trapezus, archaeologists have found traces of Persian influence: ceramics with Eastern motifs, bits of metalwork, and even the occasional seal made in the Persian style. These items were rare in the early period, but became more common as the centuries passed.
Religion shifted too. However, it reflected more of the elite network's adoption and incorporation into the existing temple structures. So the Persian elites, already frequenting temples in the Cappadocia region, continued to frequent those, while they also started to ingratiate the Hellenic temples and also started to syncretize both of them to certain degrees. And this varied across regions, obviously.
Funerary customs show the faintest blending. Mound burials mixing Greek and Eastern elements, with grave goods like raita or belts. But even these examples are few. The pattern is clear. Persian influence moved first through elite networks. Wealthy Greeks and local landowners adopted Persian objects as symbols of status, but they didn't abandon their own institutions. The Temple of Apollo in Sinope still echoed with old rituals. Councils still debated, and city walls were still being repaired regularly. Even the coins carried the same gods, as if to remind everyone that the old order still stood. Yes, cultural exchange was there, but the traditions of old endured. This was still a Hellenic outpost. In 499 BCE, Aristogoras of Miletus launched a campaign against the island of Naxos. It failed disastrously. Fearing retribution, he renounced his tyranny, declared Miletus a democracy, and called for revolt amongst the Ionians. Miletus, the very city that had once seeded the Pontic coast with colonies, now lit the spark of rebellion. A coalition of Ionian and Aeolian cities rose in defiance of the Shahanshah. For a moment, they even captured Sardis. But on the return, they faced certain defeat. And the retaliation was swift. By 494 BCE, Miletus was in ruins. Though the city would later be rebuilt, its people were enslaved or relocated. The revolt forced every Greek community under Persian rule to face a brutal choice: resist and risk annihilation, or submit and survive. In Pontus, the choice was clear. No records mention Sinope, Trapezus, or any other Pontic colony joining the revolt. No Persian armies marched north to crush them. This wasn't indifference. Geography made intervention impossible. Cut off from reinforcements, dependent on Persian trade routes, and tied to semi-autonomous status that rebellion would have destroyed. The Pontians chose pragmatism over pan-Hellenic solidarity. Ironically, this distance would later mark them as different. Greeks, yes, but never quite the same as their Ionian cousins. Yet by avoiding rebellion, they preserved their own communities, their autonomy, and their future under empire. By the late 4th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire was unraveling. Revolts in Egypt, court intrigues, and the rise of Macedon strained its grip. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, he met an empire past its prime. Within a decade, Persia was gone. And yet, through all this drama, the Pontic coast barely registers in the chronicles. No battles scarred its harbors. No sieges tested its walls. Alexander didn't waste his time up here. Most likely, the Pontic cities bent with the wind, accepting Macedonian rule without a fight. For some, it may have felt like a reconnection with the wider Greek world. For others, it was just survival. Pragmatism continued. What Persia's collapse swept away was its bureaucracy. What endured were the things that made Pontus Pontus: local councils, trade routes, and a knack for playing one empire off of another. Those habits would serve them well in the stormy age of Hellenistic kingdoms that followed. The collapse of the Achaemenid Empire in the late 4th century BCE didn't bring unity. It brought fragmentation. Alexander the Great swept through Asia Minor, toppling satraps and planting garrisons. But when he died in 323 BCE, the empire he carved apart splintered almost instantly. His generals, the Diadochi, turned on one another, and the world of the Hellenistic kingdoms was born. For regions like Pontus, long used to being someone's frontier, this chaos was an opening. No more distant capitals calling the shots. Here, survival and adaptation could finally be turned into independence. Out of this moment came Mithridates, and the beginning of the Kingdom of Pontus. It wasn't purely Greek, or purely Persian, nor purely Anatolian. It was all three: a hybrid kingdom that blended Greek civil traditions, Persian royal bloodlines, and local religious culture. From the cracks of collapsing empires, something new was built, something distinctly Pontic. Mithridates I, Ketitzes, literally meaning the founder. A man of likely Persian descent, he seized his moment in 281 BCE as Seleucid power in northern Anatolia waned, after the death of Seleucus I. Mithridates declared himself king and chose Amasya, tucked into the Pontic mountains, as his first capital. The very name Mithridates, given by Mithra, spoke to Achaemenid connections, though his lineage may have been polished for legitimacy. What mattered was his ability to carve a realm out of chaos, with the backing of local elites who shared Persian cultural ties. For ordinary people, kingship was less about loyalty than survival. In a land of mountains and river valleys, a new ruler was simply the one who kept things running. Pontus was built on three pillars: military strength, shrewd diplomacy, and geography itself. The mountains shielded it from invasion. The rivers and coasts gave it lifelines of trade, and this natural fortress allowed Mithridates and his heirs to consolidate power slowly, preparing for the battles with empires still to come. Amasya, modern Amasya, rose as the capital of Pontus and the stage for its hybrid character. Cradled within a narrow valley carved by the Iris River, the city may have been a minor Achaemenid center, but under the Mithridates, it blossomed into a royal seat. Here, the dynasty created a court that blended Persian-inspired ceremony with the vitality of Greek and local traditions. Kings wore diadems, struck idealized portraits on coins, and issued Greek inscriptions, classic symbols of Hellenistic kingship. At the same time, they followed Persian custom and hereditary succession, and patronized local cults tied to Anatolian deities. The religious life of the kingdom was layered: priesthood serving the Anatolian mother goddess, and other syncretic figures held real influence, backed by royal support. Unlike the Persian kings in the heartland, the Pontic kings left little trace of overt Zoroastrian imagery. No fire temples, no investiture scenes carved in stone. Their faith was expressed through local and Greek forms instead. This negotiation extended beyond the court. Greek polis like Sinope and Amisos kept elements of civic autonomy, but recognized Pontic sovereignty. Their coinage showed Greek gods and legends, while royal seals sometimes carried Easter motifs, like hybrid creatures or winged figures. Amasya in this way was both a capital and a crossroads, an emblem of Pontus itself, standing between Greek, Persian, and Anatolian worlds. In the brutal world of Hellenistic politics, survival meant more than winning battles. From the 3rd century BCE onward, the kings of Pontus balanced two identities: heirs to Achaemenid traditions on one hand, and Hellenistic monarchs on the other. They adopted the Greek title Basileus and maintained support for civic institutions in cities like Sinope and Amisos. Marriage diplomacy strengthened ties with neighbors like Bithynia. Unlike the Ptolemies, who built divine cults, or the Seleucids, who leaned on Greek settlers, the Pontic kings built their authority on personal loyalty, rural Anatolian strongholds, and religious prestige. Their coastal cities, meanwhile, projected Hellenic legitimacy to the wider world. Under rulers like Pharnaces I, Pontus expanded into parts of Paphlagonia and cultivated diplomatic ties with Cappadocia. Connections with Armenia were thin, while relations with Seleucids, Galatians, and Rome were more opportunistic than steady. It was the same statecraft as survival we've been seeing: flexible, calculated, and rooted in the kingdom's ability to play rivals against one another in an age of upheaval. The coastal cities, Sinope, Trapezus, and Amisus above all, were the economic lifeblood of the Pontic kingdom. Their harbors funneled grain from inland valleys, metals from the mountains, and timber from forested slopes. The slave trade would become important later, though it is less visible in the early record. These cities were also cultural centers. They kept Greek traditions alive: festivals, temples, civic rituals, even if the evidence for theaters or gymnasia is uneven. Their architecture and practices reveal a blend of Hellenic forms with local Anatolian elements. The Pontic kings understood the value of this Greek civic culture. They didn't dismantle it, they co opted it. They funded temples, oversaw public works, and issued decrees in Greek, presenting themselves as patrons of the polis. But they also infused their rule with Persian and Anatolian influences. Inscriptions and ceremonies carried imperial motifs, and under Mithridates VI, these became even more pronounced. The result was a carefully created image, Greek in language and diplomacy, but enriched with Persian grandeur and Anatolian spirituality. By the time Mithridates VI Eupator took the throne around 120 BCE, Pontus had become a real regional power. That strength was the legacy of his father and grandfather, who had expanded the kingdom's borders, patronized cities like Sinope and Amisos, and secured its prestige among Hellenistic rivals. Mithridates inherited not just territory, but a dynasty already accustomed to navigating between East and West, and a people too. His ancestors had played the diplomatic game with Rome, Cappadocia, and the Seleucids. Under Mithridates V, Pontus still maintained cooperative ties with the Roman Republic, even as the threat of Roman expansion grew clearer with each passing decade. The young king stepped into a throne built on survival. He didn't need to invent the Pontic strategy. He only needed to push it further. And in the storm that followed, he would turn that inheritance into Rome's most dangerous challenge in the East. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome's shadow stretched across the Mediterranean. Carthage was ashes, Macedonia subdued, and Asia Minor was increasingly under Roman supervision. The old Hellenistic kingdom still stood, but their independence was shrinking, step by step. It was into this world that Mithridates VI rose to power. Born around 135 BCE and thrust onto the throne as a boy, he spent his early years under regency before claiming full rule around 110 BCE. His reign would mark both the height of Pontic power and its downfall. Mithridates cast himself as more than king. To the Greeks, he posed as a champion of their culture. To Persians and Anatolians, he invoked older traditions of royal power and prestige. In reality, he was the same style of pragmatist leadership, shaping alliances, commanding loyalty, and playing identities against each other to build strength. Against Rome, he became something more. He became a symbol of resistance. Over 3 wars fought across half a century, Mithridates challenged the Republic's advance into Anatolia, threatening its provinces, its allies, and even Italy itself. For Rome, he was a menace. For those under Roman pressure, he became the last great hope that the tide could still be turned. Mithridates VI came to power in an atmosphere thick with intrigue. His father, Mithridates V, was assassinated in palace plots that left the dynasty shaken. Ancient writers claim the young heir lived for years in hiding, sharpening his wits in exile before returning to claim the throne. Whether fact or embellishment, the stories all agree on one point. His early life was forged in paranoia, survival, and an uncanny ability to adapt. The kingdom he inherited was the product of nearly 2 centuries of careful building. Amasya, the inland capital, controlled trade routes that threaded the mountains and valleys of Anatolia, while ports like Sinope and Amisos kept Pontus tied to the wider Greek world. The dynasty had long balanced Greek civil traditions with Persian-style monarchy, giving the rule both familiarity and weight. Mithridates would turn that balance into something sharper, a political weapon wielded through language, imagery, and performance. Unlike his predecessors, who mostly aimed to defend what they held, Mithridates dreamed bigger. He saw Rome rising in the west and set his sights on matching it. Over the decades of war that followed, he cast himself as a champion of Greek freedom while drawing power from Persian and Anatolian traditions. For some, the young king was a liberator. For others, a ruthless opportunist. But all agreed. No one before him had dared imagine Pontus as a rival to Rome itself. Mithridates VI knew that power meant more than soldiers and silver. It meant being able to speak to people in their own voice. Ancient writers claim he spoke a dozen languages. Though likely an exaggeration, even if he mastered just Greek, Persian, and the tongues of the Black Sea, it was enough to make him feel like a native to everyone he ruled. And to those resisting Rome, he was a liberator and ally. His coins told the same story. In one region, he appeared in Greek armor, styled after Alexander. In another, he wore the tall tiara of Persian kings. Each image was crafted for its audience, a different mask for the same monarch. But propaganda wasn't his only tool. Mithridates fortified cities like Cabera and Sinope, built up a bureaucracy to manage distant territories, and turned Pontus into a court that looked like a small empire of its own. He also obsessed over survival. Ancient sources say he studied poisons and antidotes, testing them until he believed himself immune. Maybe the stories were exaggerated, maybe not. What matters is the picture they paint. A ruler who knew that in a world of assassins and betrayal, living another day was the most important strategy of all. In 88 BCE, Mithridates unleashed the most shocking act of defiance in Pontic history, the Asiatic Vespers. On a single day, across cities and villages of Asia Minor, Pontic agents and their allies struck at Roman settlers, merchants, and officials. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. Some ancient sources say 20,000, others as many as 80,000. Whatever the number, the message was unmistakable. Rome was to be cut off of Anatolia, root and branch. This massacre ignited the First Mithridatic War. Rome answered with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the ruthless general who would later dominate Roman politics. He crushed Mithridates' forces in battle after battle, forcing the king to abandon his conquests and retreat to his mountain strongholds. Yet even in defeat, Mithridates survived. Rome allowed him to keep his crown, preferring a chastened monarch to a martyred hero. But Mithridates was not finished. Over the next 30 years, Pontus would fight Rome in 3 wars that stretched across Anatolia and beyond. He allied with Tigranes the Great of Armenia, courted support across the eastern Mediterranean, and cast himself as the champion of resistance to Roman imperialism. The coalition he dreamed of, one that could truly halt Rome, never fully materialized. Rivalries ran too deep, and Rome's counterattacks were relentless. Yet Mithridates succeeded in one undeniable way. He made himself Rome's eastern nightmare. For decades, the Republic bled time, treasure, and soldiers just to contain him. By the 60s BCE, Rome's patience with Mithridates had worn thin. 3 wars, decades of blood, and still the old king refused to disappear. Lucullus had already broken much of his power, but even crippled, Mithridates found ways to rebuild. So Rome sent its finest general, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, with orders to end the struggle once and for all. Pompey was relentless. In 66 BCE at the Battle of Lycus, he crushed Mithridates' armies. Then instead of stopping there, he remade the entire East. Provinces were reorganized, new client kings installed, and a web of dependencies spun so tight that no ruler could ever again threaten Rome from Anatolia. Mithridates, now in his late 60s, wounded and exhausted, fled north through the wild passes of Colchis to the Bosporan kingdom in Crimea. He hoped to raise yet another army from the tribes of the Black Sea. But the dream unraveled. His treasury was gone. His allies had deserted him, and even his own son, Pharnaces, turned against him. The end carried a grim irony. Ancient writers say Mithridates tried to end it all with poison, only to find that years of testing antidotes had made him immune. In the end, he had to order one of his guards to finish the job with a sword. In 63 BCE, the man who had haunted Rome for 30 years was gone. His death meant not just the fall of a king, but the end of an independent Pontus. Rome absorbed the kingdom into the province of Bithynia Pontus, leaving only faint traces of autonomy in a few coastal cities. The apocalyptic, Pontic experiment of defying Rome was over. Rome's absorption of Pontus into the province of Bithynia Pontus after the Third Mithridatic War was more than a bureaucratic shuffle. It was the deliberate dismantling of the last serious challenge to Roman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The kingdom was carved up with characteristic Roman efficiency. Some territories were handed to client kings who owed their thrones to Roman patronage. Others were drawn into the empire's administrative machine. Cities like Sinope, once proudly independent, still minted coins and managed local affairs, but now under Roman taxation and Roman law, their autonomy steadily shrinking. Yet if Rome conquered the land, it never fully conquered the memory. Mithridates' defiance lived on. To the Greek elites across the Mediterranean, he became something larger than life. Part Alexander in his ambition, part tragic rebel in his fall. Ancient writers like Appian and Plutarch painted him as both brilliant strategist and reckless dreamer. Modern historians still wrestle with his legacy. Was he a visionary who dared to imagine a world free of Roman domination, or an opportunist who overreached? What cannot be denied is the experiment he led. Pontus under Mithridates became a synthesis. Greek language and civic forms, Persian royal grandeur, Anatolian spiritual traditions. For a time, it was more than just another Hellenistic kingdom. It was the stage for antiquity's most enduring and sophisticated resistance to Rome. In the end, this resistance failed. Rome endured. But in its failure, the story of Pontus revealed the boundaries of what was possible in an age when Rome's hunger for empire seemed limitless. And that's where we'll leave the story of Pontus for now. The rise and fall of the Kingdom of Pontus. And if you made it this far, cheers. Really appreciate it. Have a good one, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one, okay? Bye.
Και να λέω σε πως το πουλί το γιαύρι το μικρό και μοντάρνι. Συμπορτά να πάνε στεκές γιάρι αράμα σε βδάλι μάμα. Όχι κείμενα ξέρω σε το πουλί το γιαύρι το μικρό και μοντάρνι. Κείμενα ξέρω σε το πουλί το γιαύρι μικρό και μοντάρνι.